Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording from our Passover Prep Learning Series.
I'm going to talk a little bit, but I really want to find out what your questions are and try to respond to them. I mean, that's really what the point of this all is, right, after all. But let me give you at least some background information, and we'll go from there. So the first thing is that this holiday is really meaningful, but it also draws out whatever anal compulsive tendencies you have, right? It's I remember in Ron Wolfson's book on Passover Seder, he was quoting Sandy Goodluck, who says that right after Purim, I start making lists and hyperventilating, which is, and frankly, in our house, literally the day after Purim, Marlon starts making Pesach, and there's less and less of the kitchen that I get to use, and all of a sudden, all of this chametz is on our counter, and we've got to get rid of it, sooner rather than later. I mean, you know the drill. So, I mean, all of that is very respectful of the holiday and all of that. But I mean, I really do want to say from the very beginning that you shouldn't let some of these details that we're going to be talking about tonight get in the way of the broad picture. The broad picture is really that this is the central story of our tradition, Exodus and Sinai, and it has a lot of meanings for us that are that really distinguish us from other traditions. I mean, if you were to, for example, to compare the central story of Christianity, the passion and resurrection of Jesus, to our story, it has many distinctions. As a matter of fact, former student of mine, Michael Goldberg, later after he finished rabbinical school, did a doctorate at Graduate Theological Union in narrative theology, and ultimately he wrote a book called The Passion Resurrection, Exodus Sinai and the Passion Resurrection, Jews and Christians Getting Their Story Straight, right? And what he did in that book was compare the vision of who we are, if you are a Jew, as to who you are if you are a Christian, right? And the stories tell a lot about what that is. I mean, among other things, we don't leave Egypt as individuals. We leave Egypt as a community, right? Very much different from our American side of our identity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So as an American, I'm an individual with rights. But as a Jew, I leave Egypt with a community. And when I get to Sinai, I don't get a single right. I get 613 commandments, right? When I do a lot of interfaith work, and I say to the Christians, this is the beginning of Jewish guilt, right? But the Catholics tell me, you know nothing about guilt. We have that cornered. I say, okay, you're welcome to it, right? And then, and then the story continues on the trek to the Promised Land. And so, what is that? And how do we contribute to life in order to try to make this life a better one for everybody, right? That's all involved in that central story of ours that Passover celebrates. So it is a really important holiday, just on a theological level, let alone for the fact that it brings together family and community, and it gets us to talk a lot about the story. And as you may know, I've taught a course on Jewish law at the law school at UCLA for many years, and one of my students said to me that the Jewish students said that he and some friends of his had invited some of their non-Jewish friends to their Passover Seder. And at the end of the Seder, one of the non-Jews said to him, "Now I understand why Jews are so good at the Socratic method. It's embedded in your religion," right? In other words, the idea to ask questions and to challenge things and that kind of thing, right? I mean, it really is very central, both in its meaning and in its mode to who we are as Jews. And I think that that's really what we need to do, and certainly what we need to focus on. And certainly, the details of the observance, which we'll talk about tonight, hopefully will not get in the way of that, but will rather augment that, and make it, possible for you to do it in a very traditional way, but at the same time, and thereby connect with the story and the way that Jews have celebrated the story for generations. I mean, that's part of what the meaning of Passover is as well. But it won't blind you to the greater meanings of it. And it certainly should not be, and let me just say it straight out at the beginning, it certainly should not be the excuse to look down on other Jews who do it differently, even if those other Jews are members of your family. So this should not be the rules of Passover and eating and all of that should not be the excuse to create bad relationships and families and friendships. So I mean, I think that also really needs to be emphasized at the very beginning, especially as I'm about to talk about a lot of the details of of making Passover. On Passover, we're not allowed, among other things, to eat chametz. So what is chametz? Chametz is one of the 5 grains that did in ancient times grow in Israel and still does, namely wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. It's those 5 grains that constitutes chametz. And in regard to those 5 grains, there are 3 different commandments in the Torah. One is that you may not eat them on Passover except under very specific circumstances, and we'll get to that. That's matzah, after all, usually comes from meat or something like from wheat, I mean. And so clearly we do eat wheat on Passover, but under very specific circumstances, namely that it's not leavened and it doesn't rise. Those 5 grains can only be eaten under these very specific circumstances of not having any leaven with them. So on the one hand, so number 1, we're not allowed to eat eat chametz. Number 2, so bal tochal is the Hebrew term for it. You may not eat it. Bal yera'eh, it may not be seen in your household, right? Which will lead to some of the practices that we have. And bal yimatzeh, it may not be found in your household, right? So those are the 3 basic rules in regard to chametz. So what does that mean? Well, that means, among other things, that whatever chametz you have in your house, if you can, you should eat it or give it away to the poor between Purim and Passover, so that the food doesn't go to waste. And it's and again, I mean, it's some of it maybe all of it, depending on how much you have, you will eat, but you just need to get it out of the pantry and put it on the counter so you know what it is you've got to get rid of before then. In our house, already starting last Shabbat, we have this barley soup, and we're going to have, right, I mean, it's going to be, what can I tell you? It's going to be a lot of carbs over the next 4 weeks. So that's part of it. And then another part of it is, of course, the spring cleaning. That is not just in our tradition. It's in a lot of other traditions, there's spring cleaning as well, but that's also part of it because it's not supposed to be found in your house or seen, right? And then the ultimate way of getting rid of it is by selling it. And this really came into Jewish law for 2 reasons. Selling your chametz to a Gentile. This came into Jewish law for 2 reasons. One was that many Jews, because when Jews were living in Christian societies in particular, Jews were not allowed to do what was honorific work, that is, work on the land. And so they had to be in business. They were dealing with money, which what the Christians thought to be dirty. But that meant that you had a lot of Jewish businesses that were things like grocery stores, liquor stores, and so on, that had a whole store of this stuff, right, that the owners could certainly not sell off within a month after Purim. So there needed to be a way in which these store owners could maintain their supply, but not sell it on Passover, but be able after Passover to reclaim it. So that was the major reason in the Middle Ages for developing this notion of mechirat chametz, of selling your chametz. But the other reason is because of a peculiarity in Jewish law, which is that throughout the rest of the year, the classical example is if a drop of milk by accident gets into a meat soup, if it is less than 1/60th of the volume of the soup, it is null and void. The term is batel b'shishim. It is voided and as 1 part in 60, right? But chametz on Passover is a sur b'chol shu. It's a forbidden under in any amount. So that's part of the reason for the spring cleaning stuff, right? In other words, the idea is to try to get rid of as much of it as you can find. I mean, depending upon what stage in life you're in, if you have small kids, it's inevitable that there's going to be crumbs all over the place. Or if you have grandchildren come around, it's inevitable that there are going to be crumbs all over the place. And even without that, even we're just talking about adults in the house, there's a need to try to clean that out. But even with that, you're going to miss something. I mean, we're all human, and there will be crumbs, in the depths of your couch or something, whatever it is. And so you sell your chametz as a way of making sure that it's not your chametz is not found in your house, even if you can't see it. That your chametz is not found in your house. It belongs to somebody else, to a non-Jew, during the time of Passover. So that's the other reason for this custom of mechirat chametz. Now, it can be done online. And I mean, it used to be that you would come to the synagogue and sell it to the rabbi, who in turn would sell it to usually the non-Jewish custodian. And that was done at Beth Am we've been members since 1971, and been done for decades, right? But now, you can do this all online. In the chat, you will find the Rabbinical Assembly, guide for Passover that I'm going to refer to several times tonight. But also, I'm sure Rabbi Klickfeld is going to send this out a couple of weeks before Passover. He and a lot of Beth Am people are in the South now on their trip. But I would imagine not this coming week because they're still in the South, but next week you'll get an email saying if you want to sell your chametz, then just fill out this form online, which effectively sells it to a rabbi in the Rabbinical Assembly, and who will then sell it before Passover to a non-Jew, and then after Passover, you have to you may want to wait for about a half an hour just to make sure that the rabbi there had time to reclaim it from the non-Jew, so that when you're eating after you're eating whatever chametz you stored away during Passover. If you're eating it after Passover, you're not stealing from the non-Jew. I mean, at least in theory, right? So you may want to wait for a half an hour or so after Passover is over before you dig into the whatever it is, cereal or pizza or whatever it is you like. One other sort of complicating factor here, and it's not really all that complicated, but in the course of generations, among Ashkenazi Jews, not among Sephardic Jews, there developed a stringency, a chumrah, on Passover that, in addition to not eating chametz from the 5 grains, except if it was done under very specific circumstances so that it didn't rise, they also did not eat kitniot, legumes is usually the way it's translated. It's beans of various sorts. And there are various theories as to why that custom arose. My guess is that it simply arose and then all of the explanations are after the fact. But to the extent that you can justify it, my guess is that it's because when you ground beans of various sorts into flour, you couldn't tell the difference between the bean flour as opposed to the wheat flour. And so what they were worried about was that you would ultimately be eating chametz, even though you were just eating beans mashed up. So I think that's where the stringency came. In recent decades, there was a true, and the Sephardim don't have that stringency. So the Sephardim will eat beans and rice on Passover without any compunctions whatsoever. In the Ashkenazi world, the Rabbi David Golinkin, who is in Jerusalem, born in the United States and trained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, but then made Aliyah, and he wrote a rabbinic ruling about 20-some years ago, in which he traced the development of this entire stringency, and he ultimately called it a minhag shtut, a stupid custom, because it really doesn't have much to recommend it. And subsequently, about 10 years ago, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the conservative movement here in the United States adopted another tshuva, another rabbinic ruling by Rabbi Amy Levin and Rabbi Avram Reisner, and they came to the same conclusion. So there are those who will eat, including Ashkenazi Jews, who will eat kitniot on Passover, and there are those who will not. And let me just say that even though I was really convinced by those arguments, at least until this year, there are no kitniot in our house on Passover. And this is something I learned a long time ago, actually. The first year, Marilyn and I have been married 55 years. The first year we were married, I was in rabbinical school, and in the 2 months or so before Passover, we were studying the laws of Passover. And then as now, the day after Purim, Marlon starts making Passover, and I started telling her, you don't have to do this. I can show you chapter and verse in the Shulchan Aruch about what you need to do and what you don't need to do. And she said to me, get out of here. You're not going to trape up my kitchen. And who was her authority? Her mother, of course, right? So you need to know that. I mean, so anyway, until this year, actually, we did not have kitniot in the house. I think this year, Marlon has finally decided it's enough already. But we'll see what happens. In any case, at worst, it's 8 days in which you're not eating beans and things like that. But even if you do that, if the derivatives of kitniot certainly are not forbidden on Passover, because that would be a chumrah and a chumrah, a stringency on a stringency, and that has no basis in Jewish law. So even if you don't eat peanuts, let's say, although there's a tshuva by Rabbi Ben Zion Bergman, whom some of you may remember, Aloha Shalom, who wrote, when he and I first got onto the law committee in the mid-1980s, the very first meeting I had was in December of 1984, and they were talking about whether string beans were kosher for Passover. And I raised my hand and I said, you know what? My kids couldn't care less about string beans. What they really want to know about is peanut butter and ice cream. So he wrote a tshuva called Peanuts from the Ground Up, in which he demonstrated that peanuts were never part of the kitniot in Europe. They were an American phenomenon, right? So you could never include peanuts in the definition of kitniot. But even if you did, the oil from peanuts would be kosher for Passover, right? Because that's a derivative from the kitniot. And in the same sort of a way, corn oil, if you don't, and by the way, the corn that we have is not the corn in Europe either. It's really maize, right? It's an American kind of product, but we'll leave that as it is, right? But any of the derivatives, even if you observe the stringency on kitniot, any of the derivatives of kitniot are permissible for Ashkenazi Jews who are keeping that stringency. It does, I want to make one other general point, and then we're going to get to some of the specifics. Because of the rule that I mentioned to you a moment ago, namely that during the rest of the year, unintended ingredients in a product that you don't want there are void if they are a 60th or less of the volume of the product. That applies to not just the milk and soup. That applies to any product. So therefore, if you buy things that are clearly not chametz, things like milk, or cottage cheese without flavoring and stuff like that, right? Or for those of you that have grandchildren that are infants, baby foods, just something like, strained apricots or strained peaches or whatever, right? If you do that before Passover, then if anything is in there that you didn't intend, that is batel b'shishim. You don't need the point is that you don't need a hechsher for Passover on milk or on cottage cheese or on any of the kinds of things that you would assume do not have wheat, oats, barley, spelt, or rye in it. So that's one thing that you will see in the guide for Passover that is in the chat. So if you look in the chat, I asked Ari to put it the link there, and you can download the guide for Passover of the Rabbinical Assembly. And one of the things that they will say there is that if you buy these things before Passover, then you don't need a hechsher on them for Passover. That will save you a little money, by the way, and it will, and frankly, it's well within the laws of Passover to do that. There are some things that if you're going to buy them during Chol Moed on Passover that you do need a hechsher for, and for that, and some things that you need a hechsher for no matter when you buy them. So matzah, of course, you need a hechsher for Passover. Any kind of cakes or candies or things like that, you need to have a hechsher for Passover on, and because of those kinds of things, you expect that there may be some of these ingredients in it. Certainly, there are Passover cereals, and if you love those kind, you not have to have cereal in the morning. I'm one of those people, but I don't eat Passover cereals because they're disgusting. Anyway, so I switched to cottage cheese and matzah in the morning during Passover. But but if you're going to have those things where you would really expect chametz to be in, or kitniot, if you're observing that stringency, then those kinds of things you really do need a hechsher for Passover on. And in that guide, you're going to see more detail than you ever wanted to know about all of this. One last thing, pots and pans and dishes and all of that. Now, it really depends upon, the family. There are some families that have a completely separate set of dishes, some both milchik and fleishik dishes for Passover, and a completely separate set of pots and pans for Passover. And if that is your custom, then that's what will happen, right? You'll put away, usually like the day before Passover, you'll put away the yearly pots, pans, and dishes that you use, and bring out the ones that you use only for Passover. If you don't have that, then the question is, how do you kasher these things for Passover? And again, in the guide that's in the chat, you will see the exact instructions. But by and large, the general rule is kivul o kach polto, as a pot or pan or dish would consume or would cake in any kind of food product, so it would expel it. So the measuring process depends upon how porous the particular plate or pot or pan is. If you're talking about, start with the easy things. If you're talking about glasses that you use only for cold drinks, then those kinds of things, all you need to do is wash them. If you want to be really strict, wash them in your dishwasher, right? To make sure that there's really nothing there that came from the sponge or something like that. Okay? Similarly, if you have glass dishes, or dishes that are that have the same lack of porosity as glass, and that of course leads to all kinds of questions about what is in Corningware and what is in all of these other kinds of things that we now have. right? And you can see that in the guide, there are certain kinds of materials that are as imporous as glass is, and then you can then just wash them. Now, for metal things, and that's most of your pots and pans, and for metal things, what you need to do is boil water in them and let it, the biggest one you have, put all your pots and pans and your silverware in the largest pot you have, and fill it with water and boil, and let it, and fill it with boiling water, and let it spill over a little bit. It gets a little messy, and put all of your pots and pans and silverware in that, because I'm assuming that they are all metal, and as long as they're all metal, that will work. If you have wooden handles on them, that gets more complicated. And then for your oven, there are some people who actually use a blowtorch for their oven. I don't think you really need to do that. All you have to do is, first of all, clean out your oven. And if you have a self-cleaning oven, use that, that facility. And then after you've done that, just, if you have a self-cleaning oven, that's probably all you need to do, frankly. If you don't have a self-cleaning oven, then just clean it out as well as you can, and then raise it to the highest temperature it goes to, and let it be there for, say, half an hour, and then let it cool down, and then maybe wash it out one more time just to be on the safe side, and you're done. And what you've done is, by the way, that's the same thing that you would do during the year if you were changing a Fleischig oven to a milchig oven or something like that, right? Or changing a Fleischig pot to a milchig pot, or the other way around. Or if something, you made a mistake and it was a milk soup in this Fleischig pot that you had, and you want to re-kasher it as Fleischig, that's the way you would do it, with boiling water. There are, in terms of counters, there are certain kinds of counters that all you need to do, that are not porous, and therefore all you need to do is wash them. So when we remodeled our house, we got Caesar stone from Israel, which specifically comes with a letter from a rabbi that this is non-porous, and therefore on Passover, all you have to do is wash it, right? Not so clear with other kinds of ceramics. I mean, other kinds of, or a wooden top, in which case what you would have to do is cover it, so that where the food is, and even where your dishes are on top of the cover, as opposed to where the normal tabletop is. So again, that's all covered in that guide, and you can see exactly which tabletops are we know to be non-porous, and therefore all you have to do is wash them, and which ones you need to do more for in order to kasher it. Okay, I think I've covered what I wanted to cover, because I want to hear your questions. So please tell me. Just unmute yourself, and we're a small enough group. Just unmute yourself, and if you have particular questions, I'm happy to answer them. Go ahead. Yes.
Rabbi, every year during Passover, we cover our countertops. They are granite, so I'm not sure if I'm overdoing the isolating that chametz, or.
You may be. Let me double check here. I have a copy of the Passover guide in front of me. I just printed it out. And see, the thing is, let me just say, this comes from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement, and we have a subcommittee on kashrut, now chaired by Rabbi Aaron Alexandro, you may remember, because he was at Beth Am for a number of years. So let me see what he says here. Work surfaces. Tables, closets, and counters should be thoroughly cleaned and covered for Passover. The covers can be contact paper, regular paper, foil, or cloth that does not contain chametz, that is being starched with chametz. Note that the covering material should be made of material that is not easily torn. Many countertops can be kashered simply by thorough cleaning. A 24-hour wait. I forgot to mention that. after you clean it, you're supposed to wait for 24 hours to make sure that, that you didn't miss anything. And then, so you let it just lie for 24 hours, and then you can use it for Passover. And irui, boiling water over it. To have the effect of kashering, the service must have no hairline cracks, nicks, or scratches that can be seen with the naked eye. So, plastic luminates, limestone, soapstone, granite, marble, glass, corian, theron, Caesar stone, swanstone, sorrel, and ebonite surfaces can be kashered simply by irui, that is, by boiling water over them. And then you don't have to cover them.
Unless there's a seam or a...
That's right, unless there's a seam or some crack in them. Yeah, that's right. But if there's no crack in them, then you just need to wash them and then pour boiling water over them and then wait for 24 hours and you're done. Okay?
Thank you.
Wood without scratches is also kashered that way. If you have a wooden tabletop that has no scratches in it whatsoever, you can pour boiling water over it, assuming that that's not going to ruin your tabletop. Right? So you have to decide, you have to take that into account as well. Ceramic, cement, or porcelain countertops cannot be kashered by irui, and those are the ones that you have to cover. Okay? If you have a granite tabletop, then you don't have to cover it anymore. You just have to pour boiling water over it and then wait for 24 hours, and you're into Passover with your tabletop. Okay, good. Hey, other questions? Yes, please, Nancy.
I'd like to go back to you're talking about oil, the derivatives. So does that mean there's oil that you can't use, or are most oils okay?
Most oils are okay. Certainly olive oil is, because olives themselves are not, and not even kitniot, let alone chametz, right? And peanut oil is definitely okay, because of Rabbi Bergman pointed out that even for those who don't eat kitniot on Passover, peanuts were not in Europe and therefore were not part of kitniot. So peanut oil would be fine. But even corn oil or something, even things that are really kitniot, or soybean oil or something like that, right? Even that stuff is frankly fine.
It's good to know.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Others. It's not all or nothing. So if you think of things, in the next month that you want to ask me, just email me and I'll be happy to try to answer them for you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask a question. I see in the stores, whole wheat matzah that's kosher for Passover, and spelt matzah and other grains, and it is with the Passover items. And I know some people for digestive issues may need it, but how about the general population? Would they be able to eat a whole wheat matzah that it says kosher for Passover? Or
yeah, it's the one that some, not all, the one that some Orthodox rabbis do not like to use for the Seder or something like that is egg matzah. Because there what you're doing is you're adding ingredients to to what is supposed to be lechem oni. It's supposed to be a poor person's bread. Mm-hmm. So if it's a poor person's bread, presumably the person would not have eggs to add to the wheat and water, right? But any kind of just plain matzah made out of, you name it, any of these 5 grains, including spelt or rye or wheat, or some people are gluten allergic, right? And so for them, wheat is terrible. But oats are okay. So if they can find oat matzah, that's all right. And the reason why it's okay is because it is baked in a particular way to guarantee that it doesn't rise. So it has to be baked at a very high temperature and without leavening, and taken out of the oven within, I think it's 18 minutes or something like that. So that's what makes matzah kosher for Passover, even though if you had leavening on it, that would be chametz. That would be the classical definition of what chametz is.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. And there are, by the way, there are also a number of issues for vegetarians, right, in terms of like the Passover Seder. Do you have to have a shank bone on your Passover plate? Can you have something else to symbolize the ancient Passover, the Paschal Lamb, right? The Passover Seder and the Passover sacrifice. And people have become very, what shall I say, innovative about that, right? And there are, and you can see a lot of this, and some of it will be in the Passover guide, but you can also see a lot of this in, if you just go online, Passover for vegans or something, right? And see what some of the accommodations are that vegans and or vegetarians have made. Now, again, it's going to be different for vegans than it is for vegetarians, and different again for vegetarians than it is for pescatarians, those who will also eat fish, and different again from carnivores, right? From people who will eat meat under the prostrus, under the restrictions of kasher. But you can, because there are far more vegans and vegetarians now than there were even, say, 20, 30 years ago, including Rabbi Klickfeld, as you heard on his Passover sermon, his Yom Kippur sermon, right? I'm sure there will be, if you have any questions, if you're a vegan and you have any questions about, what do I do instead of the shank bone or whatever, I'm sure I'll be happy to answer them for you. I myself am a veggie, but my wife is not, so what can I tell you? Okay. Okay, did I answer you? Yes. Did I answer your question? Yes. Okay, good. All right, other questions?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It's kind of a different kind of question. I hear what you're saying about kitniot. I get it. It makes sense. In the pandemic, it will make life easier. But I'm now an orphan. When the last parent died, actually, I'm still in the year. Mm-hmm. And which is why I was a little late. I was at Minyan saying Kaddish anyway. Right. But when I think about what I remember my parents doing, reading ingredients, and this was in the age of corn syrup, so everything was there. There's this feeling of Kibbud Av V'Aim that, anyway, I'm just interested if you have a comment on the hierarchy of mitzvos, and in this case, this is what my parents did, and it somehow feels, and maybe it's just because it's in the year, and the parent that died was my mother, who, of course, had more to do in the kitchen. And I'd just be interested if you have any comments on that one.
Well, that is, before you came on, I mentioned the fact that when I was in rabbinical school my first year, we were studying the laws of Passover in the 2 months before Passover, and when my wife started making it, I told her that she didn't have to do certain things because in the Shulchan Aruch it says this, and she chased me out of her kitchen and said she's not going to trape it up, that her mother's going to be the authority here, right? So that, and it is really, in a lot of families, that has gone from certain practices, one generation to the next. And that, I think, depends very much upon the degree to which the degree to which that's meaningful to you. So, I mean, my mother, filled the bathtub with water and put the glasses in the bathtub for 24 hours, and then drained the bathtub and filled it again for another 24 hours, and yet again a third time. Well, first of all, we have a drought in Southern California, so you should not do that custom. Okay, I mean that has to come into account as well. But certainly a lot of the other customs that my parents passed down to me, we do them. And of course, a marriage is always bringing together two worlds. So some of the customs that we do are from Marlon's family, and some of the things that just developed on our own. The Seder that Marlon and I have had over 55 years, is really rather different from the Seder that either my father-in-law led or my father led. It's much more interactive and it's much more questioning and all of that. They tended to just read through the Haggadah and that was that. Whereas I love an argument, so we get involved in I have a PhD in philosophy, and a philosophy professor of mine in graduate school said, a philosopher is a 5-year-old child who never stopped asking why. That's who I am. And so I love that kind of Socratic method around the Seder table. So, I mean, if you looked at our Seder as opposed to my parents' Seder or my in-law Seder, it looks somewhat different. It looks a lot different, actually. But the foods are not all that different. Except now, because I'm a veggie, there are certain things that my in-laws in particular, who are really meat eaters, would never think was appropriate for Passover. Right? Not because it violated any laws. It's just that's not what we eat on Passover. It's custom, right? And different families have very different customs, especially on Passover. If you've ever visited other families, you will find out that even people that you're close to, you don't be surprised if they do certain parts of the Passover Seder differently from the way that you do them. And because Passover is really rich in differing customs, not just between, Ashkenazi communities and Sephardi communities and Persian communities, but even within each of those groups. What the northern Polish kind of cities, or villages did was different from what the southern Polish, cities did, and let alone the Germans and the Romanians and Hungarians and the Russians and all of that, right? And that was all within the Ashkenazi world. But it's not even in terms of subsets of each of these large segments of the Jewish community, but one family to another. And that's fine. That's really fine. I think it adds to the richness of the holiday. And in terms of specific, food patterns, I mean, I think whatever gives you meaning and carrying down what your parents did, you should do, unless there's some clear objection to it, in one way or another, right? Maybe they ate a lot of meat and you don't. So then you're going to have to adjust what they did to what you do. That's just one example. Did you have something else in mind?
No, I like that, but it did make me think of I'm Litvak on both sides, so spices and not sugar, and going somewhere and they've got sugar in their gefilte fish, and I'm like, how do you even eat this? Or a sweet kugel. So I think I'm going to go to keeping the whole checking for corn and whatever. But
okay, that's fine.
I'd like,
and there are different customs about it's called brachen, right? That is broken up matzah. Can you use that to make cakes and things like that, right? Some do and some don't, right? And the fear that those who don't, and the fear that it will rise, even though you're not using yeast. If you're not sticking to, I think again 18 minutes, then it's not. Then it might be chametz. So there are those who will not use brachen, I think it's called in Yiddish, right? In other words, broken up matzah, and there are those who will. So I mean, it's every generation takes from the previous generation, and then does its own thing with that, and passes it on to the next generation. So if you're going and visiting, by the way, let me say this, if you're going to visit your adult children's Seder, if they don't do it exactly the way you do, don't criticize them. Okay? That doesn't make for, friends. That's not a way to win friends and influence people. Right? So, I mean, or if you're going to somebody else, into a friend's home or something, be prepared for the fact that it is perfectly fine that, that different families have different customs as to how they do the Seder and what kinds of foods they serve and all of that. Okay. Any other questions? Well, again,
you said
sure,
that the thing that we're talking about, broken matzah, do people call that gebroits? I don't know quite how to say.
Yeah, it's a okay. Yes, I think I got that wrong. Yes, I got the Yiddish right. Yes, and there are those who use it and those who don't. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Esther. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
I have a question. You said that I'm also very interested in sort of traditions and things like that, and you're saying that in different parts of Europe, Jewish communities celebrated or maybe read the Haggadah differently. that there were so many different customs and different. I understand maybe from an Ashkenazic family to a Sephardic family, but isn't the Haggadah the Haggadah?
Yeah, I mean, until very recently in Jewish history, there was the Haggadah, the Maxwell Haggadah. Some of you may remember, right? There was the text, but what I meant was that, in some communities it was just simply read aloud, and in some communities there was a lot of discussion about it. And in some communities, they would especially, now we have daylight savings time, which raises a whole other set of questions, right? Because at least officially, you're not supposed to start the Seder until it's dark. But given daylight savings time, a month from now, it won't get dark until about 8:30 or 9. So then what do you do with either children or older adults who can't stay up until past midnight, right? And so what's going to happen, I mean, Rabbi Kligfeld told me that for the second Seder, they're going to do, this is what we've done for many years now in our family as well, before sunset, you do as much of Magid as you can, right? And that's the telling the story and singing some of the songs and things like that, right? And then once the sun has set, you literally do the Seder. That is, but when you get to Magid, the fifth part of the Seder where you tell the story, by that time you've done most of it. So you just do 2 or 3 lines of it and then you go to eat, right? But so you have to, as a matter of fact, there's a tshuva, a rabbinic ruling that the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards approved about this issue by Rabbi Joshua Heller, who's from Atlanta. It's not called this, but it's Seder Shalom B'Seder, right? A Seder that's not according to the order, right? And why would you do this? You would do this because of daylight savings time, and because you either have, little kids or you have elderly people who cannot stay up until 2 a.m, something like that, right? So you need to, adjust in that way as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, first. Okay.
All right. Sure, go ahead.
Rabbi Kleefeld being the rabbi, I forget what he called it, but the one where you end with Sukkot de Zimra and start with Musaf.
Oh yeah, Hafochu. That's right. We had one service like that when we had the musical group, and we had a lot of people visiting us that one Shabbat in February, I think, if I remember correctly, right? And his point was that just to try it, because a lot of the good melodies for singing the services are for Psukei de Zimra,
right?
But people don't show up for that.
Right.
So for the fun of it, and really not as an example of what to do year in and year out, we went out the opposite way. So we started with Adon Olam, and then Aleinu, and then Musaf, and then the Haftarah reading, and then the Torah reading, and then Shacharit, and then the end of it was Psukei de Zimra, where we could sing through a lot of it. It was a lot of fun.
Right.
But again, that was not intended to be a model for the rest of the year. It was just for the fun of it. But in some ways, it's very much what I was just talking about is very much like this. Yes, I mean it's basically taking the Magid section, which is the longest anyway, in a traditional Seder, and putting as much of that before the Seder as you can, so that by the time sunset happens, you can just simply you can do just a few lines of it and then move on to dinner, basically. Yeah.
You light the candles before you do the Magid?
No. And especially this year, the first day is Shabbat, and so you're not allowed to light candles on Shabbat altogether, right? You light it before Shabbat, but not on Shabbat. So, but even if it were not that way, let's say it was Tuesday, Wednesday, or something, you're not supposed to light candles for the second day before the first day is over, because that's seen as sort of itself. It's seen as sort of itself to the first day.
The sunset, the second day, where you light the candles the second time. Yeah.
That's right. So you would wait until after sunset, and then light the candles, and then do Kiddush and the rest of what comes before Magid, right? And then just a few sentences about Magid, and then you move on to the sorry, matzah maror, the Hillel sandwich, and eating
That was
the
a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Okay. Yeah. We Jews are very creative. What can I say?
So, yeah.
All right. So again, you have my email in the Beth Am directory, but in case you don't, Dorff, EDORFF, at AJU, that's American Jewish University, at AJU.edu. Dorff, EDORFF, at AJU.edu. So you can either email me or my phone numbers are in the directory. You'll probably find me more often at home than at the office these days because I only teach on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So on the other days of the week, I'm usually home working on a writing project. So, but feel free to call me. I'll be happy to answer what questions you have.
Okay. Thank you so much. Wow.
My pleasure.
Very interesting. Very good.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.